I think you need the app. I don't even know what the app is, but like on your phones right now, it'll say you need an app. There's no need for you. You can check and see if this works if you want. But there, I see Shirley again. Ethan.
Wait,
Ethan
where's
here? Hi, Ethan.
On your email.
So all I see is Ethan and Shirley on. But, well, right, but like, I can see. And it like flips back and forth.
Ooh.
Oh, I have to go to reminders.
All right, so questions.
I don't know.
You can just fire away, basically. Anybody who. Yep.
I just have a quick question on how we're going to be tested on the Narnia books.
How are we going to be tested on the Narnia books? Basically, if you know if you can describe the plot well and you know the characters well, not like exhaustively, but if and like major events that happen, you should be okay. You're going to have to connect them. I mean, it's going to be. It's going to be kind of like analogy, like a connection, just like we did when you wrote them down, but you just don't know what the analogy will be.
So we'll have to make the connections on the go.
Yep, make the connections on the go. Yeah. So please, you don't have to, but you should bring Narnia, like it's Prince Caspian and Silverchair. I have like 2 hard copies of the giant volumes if you want them, or like if you would need them, like if you forget it. I don't want you to plan on doing that. Somebody talked about like if you just use an electronic device for the reader, like iPad or iBook. I don't know if that applies to anybody, but you can't have any electronic devices. So, all right, so questions. Check the study guide.
You like explain all the historians.
Okay. So explain all the historians. Let me pull up the study guide. So all the historians, so I'm looking at the study guide, and it's the history of history, and basically bullet points 1 and 2 and 3. Well, it's all the historians in unit 1. So, big idea. So there's 3 historians we looked at. 2 of them are Greek, 1 of them is Roman, and these are just some of the most famous historians in history. They're the standard ones in like the great books of the Western world and Western Civ. So Herodotus, Thucydides, and Tacitus. Herodotus broadly is about pride and change. Pride and change. And a fancy word for change is mutability. So Herodotus is going to be looking for examples and telling stories about examples of people who were too proud, and the way empires that maybe used to be great fall, or vice versa, empires that are weak rise to power. So he tells a story about the rise to power of Persia. And then he tells the story about Persia invading Greece, which actually, when Greece fights them off, that makes Greece mighty too. The details of that we can go into in a bit if you want. Thucydides, so Herodotus is writing about pride and mutability and change, and he's writing about the Greco-Persian Wars, Greece versus Persia. And there's 2 main invasions. One is with Darius, the guy who's like, sire, remember the Athenians, and then one is with Xerxes, his son, who whips the water when he's pissed and chops off the dude and sets his body at the top of the gates. And he's giving examples of pride. The next historian is Thucydides. he is later, and he's the historian of the Peloponnesian War. And Peloponnesian War is Athens versus Sparta. So Athens versus Sparta. And Thucydides is interested in two things. Kind of basically the way humans always are through history. He thinks just humans have always been this way and they always will be this way. And namely, he explores how they use power, and basically that people with power are bullies. Like, that's a simple way to put it. And then the other thing he explores is related to this is human nature and human nature under pressure. So he's going to talk about how people's behavior just goes to crap in the Plague of Athens, when everybody's dying and they're like, what's the point of being moral? And their morality goes out the window and religion goes out the window because the gods aren't helping them. But then he also talks about power and gives the example of the Melian dialogue, Melian. This was in the crash course video. And Athens goes to this kind of small island. They want to be neutral. They're like, hey, can we go Switzerland? And the Athenians are like, no, you have to choose. And they're like, hey, can you like just let us be neutral? And you guys are bullies. And Athens says the strong do whatever it is. The strong do what they want. The strong do what they can. The weak suffer what they must. And Herodotus is basically like, this is how it works in history. The like power. People with power are bullies, and that's just how power works. The people with power get to do whatever the heck they want. So that's broadly about Thucydides. And then Tacitus is Roman. And he, in one word, I would say Tacitus is about corruption. And he's horrified at the emperors, the recent emperors. And I'm looking at the third bullet point on the study guide now. It says, describe Tacitus, the Romans' approach to history. Who did he study, and what kinds of things did he highlight? And there's a reading online of Tacitus, something about Tacitus the Great, and this is pretty much on the back of that page. And it says something to the effect of, Tacitus's great masterpiece is his portrait of Tiberius. So he looks at the emperors and how corrupt they are, and then he paints a portrait of Tiberius. And Tiberius is super corrupt, and you might remember that Tiberius is so corrupt that he is a pedophile. And Tacitus says that he was so perverted that basically people had to invent new words for the kind of junk that he did. So he's horrifying. So Tacitus is looking at corruption and bad character and like basically just, oh my gosh, our emperors are horrible. So that's like, so I would say Herodotus, change, immutability, and pride. Thucydides, power and human nature under pressure. And what I mean under pressure is when you're in a plague trapped in the city of Athens because the Spartans are outside and you have a plague and a quarter of you are dying, and what happens to people's behavior and basically he's like, yeah, they abandon all order and morality, and it's dog eat dog and good luck, survival of the fittest, basically. Human nature under pressure. And then Tacitus, corruption, and oh my gosh, our leaders are horrific. And especially Emperor Tiberius, who's this perverted, cruel, tyrannical pedophile. So that's the Adam, do you ask that? Or Jackson? Who asked Ryan. So that's like the broad overview of the historians. What I want you to be able to do is like tell some of the stories of history to illustrate pride and change and that kind of stuff. So we can go in depth on that, or we can go on to another question, come back to it. Somebody else want to ask? Yep.
Could you go into a little bit more depth on the Greek philosophers?
All right. So Greek philosophers. So it's study guide, ancient Greece, and I guess the last 4 bullet points: Socrates, Plato's allegory of the cave, and Aristotle's ethics. I'm losing my voice. All right, so the first one, Socrates. So I'll just kind of go through the study guide, I guess. Socrates as the midwife. Some of you have heard of Socratic seminars. Well, so why does Socrates ask questions and not give answers? Yeah.
Because doesn't he believe that wisdom is knowing that you're ignorant and not trying to pretend that you're someone you're not, and having all this knowledge that you don't have?
So that's part of it. So to elaborate on that story, wisdom is ignorance. I think I told you this story. So Socrates' friend Chaerephon, I think it is, goes to the oracle at Delphi. He says, "Who's the wisest person?" And the oracle says, "Socrates." And Socrates says, "That's ridiculous. I am not the wisest person. I'm going to go around and find somebody wiser than me and prove the oracle wrong." So he goes around Athens asking all these questions like, "Hey, do you know what justice is? Hey, do you know what piety is? Hey, do you know what beauty is?" And ultimately, he asks all these questions to the leading thinkers and humiliates them, because they clearly don't know what they're talking about. And he's like, wow, maybe the oracle is right. Nobody knows anything, but they think they know. I'm actually wise because I know that I don't know anything. All these other people think they know something, but they don't. So wisdom is knowing that you don't know anything. So that's part of why he asks questions. But he's known as a midwife. And I do recall that I told one class that a midwife was someone who helped give birth to babies by jumping on the pregnant woman's stomach and the baby popping out. And that is not the way midwifing works. But a midwife does help the woman give birth. And so Socrates asks questions basically because he believes that you have the knowledge inside you, but you have to give birth to it. And with that analogy, notice that learning should be probably a little bit painful rather than like Sesame Street, where it's all fun and games, right? Like if you're giving birth to knowledge, is probably a painful process. So anyway, take that for whatever it is. But he's asking questions, and so you may have had Socratic seminars or Socratic seminars, and in those, in elementary school or middle school, the teacher or the students are just supposed to ask questions, right? So he doesn't have the truth, and he figures if he can just ask you questions, you can give birth to it. That's why he's like a midwife. He's helping you give birth to the truth. He's not giving you the truth. You are giving birth to the knowledge baby. So I'm looking at the Socrates stuff. Let's see. Midwife giving birth to truth. Socrates is also a gadfly. A gadfly is like a pest. Who is he pestering? Yes, people. What particular people? Starts with an A and ends with Athenians. So he views himself as Athens is this giant horse, or just a horse, and he's a pestering fly, and he's buzzing them and stinging them, and he says to Athens, citizens of Athens, how can you worry, and this is interesting, right, because it's still relevant today, how can you worry about fame and reputation and wealth and riches and not worry about your soul? And he says the most important thing about you is your soul, like who you really are and your character. Stop seeking for money and wealth and riches and glory, and worry about your soul. So the most important task in life is caring for your soul, because the soul is who you really are. The soul is who you really are. And so he's a gadfly trying to stir up the Athenians to think, be more reflective. One of Socrates' most famous sayings is the unexamined life is not worth living. Is that one of the, well, I mean, I didn't put it on your study guide, but that's super famous. The unexamined life is not worth living, right? Athenians, think about how you live. Live carefully. Don't be mindless and brainless. And so the last part of that, I think I've covered the other ones. The last part of that is examples of Socrates as an ideal human. Some of the stories that Plato gives. One example of Plato, or people, actually it's not even Plato who says it, one of the characters in his dialogues, I forget who, says nobody's ever seen Socrates drunk, right? He drinks a lot, but he's like perfectly temperate. And temperate is one of the words you should know in another context. What does temperance have to do with? Huh? One of the four cardinal virtues. What has to do with pleasure, right? Not too much, not too little, but just the right. Yeah, I don't know about pacing yourself. That's what they say at a college party. I pace myself so I get plastered later. No, like Socrates never gets drunk, right? He's like he drinks the perfect amount. Yeah. Probably, yeah. Most people throughout history have admired Socrates, and oftentimes people have seen analogies between Socrates and Jesus, right? Because both die for their beliefs, and they tried to free people and from their ignorance and sin and whatnot. Socrates doesn't have a conception of sin, but what was I saying? Oh, ideals. Examples of Socrates as an ideal human. When he parties, he doesn't party too much. Like he's the exact opposite of a student at CU Boulder. What else? There's one example where he stands in the same spot all day just pondering a problem, and stands there all night and then just walks away after he's kind of solved it. Even in battle, there was a story where they're retreating, and he's just like walking so proud and confidently that the enemy didn't want to attack him because they kind of feared him. But that's fine. Like, so he's viewed as like kind of just this perfect person. So that's Socrates. He teaches Plato. Socrates, like Jesus, also never writes anything down. Plato writes down all the stuff about Socrates. So Socrates teaches Plato. Oh, another example of ideal human, and this is important. How does Socrates die? Yeah, he drinks the poison, drinks the hemlock, and he handles his death really calmly and confidently. And he's like, how do we know that death isn't the best thing that could happen to us? He's like teaching them as he dies. Interestingly, Cicero, you wouldn't know about this, but I think it's Nero commands Cicero. No, Cicero gets assassinated. Oh, it's another guy named Seneca, I think. But Roman philosophers took their cue from Socrates, and this is just interesting. Sorry, this is not on the final. Sorry for wasting your time, but I can't resist. Nero tells Seneca, I think, you're dead. You have to kill yourself. Like if you don't do it within 5 hours, we're gonna come kill you. So he slits his veins or whatever, and he's trying to bleed out, but he's so old that he's not bleeding out. He's all this pain, and they keep trying to do it. He drinks poison, and he still can't. Nothing will happen. But in the meantime, he's discoursing on the nature of death and being a true philosopher of I'm not afraid of death. And all these people take their example from Socrates. So he's an ideal human that he dies this exemplary death, this amazing death of calmness and confidence, and that's how you die, is how Socrates dies. And then he refuses to escape. They come in and they're like, hey, we've bribed the guards, they'll let you go. And he's like, no, if I've accepted the good of Athens, I need to accept their judgments too of Athens. So that's Socrates. Plato. So Plato is Socrates' student. Plato writes all these things down about Socrates. And it's the allegory of the cave. And the best way to see if you understand the allegory of the cave is to ask you, what does Plato think about sense experience? First off, what is sense experience, and what does Plato think about sense experience?
It's the five senses, but he thinks that it's only Oh wait, how did you phrase it?
So the five senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching.
Or like not the truth, like the purest form.
Your five senses don't get you knowledge or truth. And the key thing is physical. The key thing is physical. So Plato, one of the main ideas of the allegory of the cave is that there are two worlds. There's the world of the physical, which we are all in, and that's the world of the five senses. And then there's the world of the forms. And that is non-physical. So you can think of physical versus, here's some contrast with Plato. Physical, non-physical. Changing, not changing, or eternal. Becoming, like turning into and changing, or being, just purely existing and not changing. Sense experience, mind or intellect or reason. These are contrasts. World of the cave, outside the cave. World of, I guess, sense experience, world of the forms. So Plato doesn't like this world of physicalness because it's always changing. It's never the same. And so it's related to that triangle stuff. What do triangles have to do with all this? Yeah. Which triangles? Physical. You have never, I saw some of this. You have never seen a true triangle. Like if I draw a triangle on the board, it's not a true triangle because it's not perfectly straight. It's a little bit crooked. Even a computer can't. You'd zoom in and you'd seen all the pixels. So it's not even a line, right? There's no such thing as a perfect triangle in the physical world, but it does exist somewhere. Where? You access it through your mind by thinking about it. And so your reason can get you to the perfect triangle. It's in the world of the forms. And Plato would say, this triangle has existed for all eternity. And that perfect triangle is every other triangle in this world is trying to be like that triangle. It's all a copy. Which if you recall from Silver Chair, that was the Aslan, or Aslan. It was the Green Witch and the world above, and she's like, no, you've seen. There's no sun. There's just lamps, and you just made up a bigger sun from the lamp. But Plato says no. Originally there was a sun, and the lamp is a copy of the sun. The sun is perfect, and the lamp is a copy. How about in the allegory of the cave? What is perfect and what's a copy?
The shadows.
The shadows are the copy. And remember, the shadows are created by the light, right? But the real light goes out of the cave, right? And it blinds him, like the truth blinds the person. And he comes back in the cave from the reason and thinking about it, and he uses his physical senses, and remember, he can't see anything. And actually, they kill him. Just like Jesus. He's trying to teach them, and they're like, what? There's no real world. And so Plato's whole point is there's two worlds. We spend our time worrying about this world. Physical. All of this that you can see, hear, taste, smell, touch. That's the physical world. It's not as important as the true world with your reason. One more example of that, beauty. The world of the forms of beauty. So, fluffy unicorns, rainbows, Zac Efron, and hot girl. I don't know who's viewed as hot these days. You could contemplate them. So for Plato, you can, like the checkout counter, all those magazines, People magazine or whatever, and you see all the famous hot people on there, the celebrities. You could, so for Plato, I don't know why this is so, I won't name you on YouTube. And all right.
Here.
Yeah. So for Plato, here's the idea. actually, so this might work better than all the different examples. So you have all those different magazines at the checkout stand, like what is it, Us Weekly and People, and so there's all these beautiful people, and you could look at all those beautiful people, but Plato says that's not true beauty. It's a copy of true beauty. Where is true beauty? You access it through reason, and it's in the world of the forms. And so instead of looking with your physical eyes at those all magazines, think about what they all share in common. And in Plato would be like, just contemplate that. Notice body plays very little role. Just use your reason and contemplate it. Be like, oh, beauty. And seriously, that's Platonic contemplation of the forms, and that's the most important thing you can do. And Plato's like, sure is nice that we have slaves to do all this work for us so we can sit around and just contemplate crap, right? Like that's part of their. And so Aristotle and Plato's God, they just sit there and like contemplate themselves because they're like, God is the highest thing. So for Aristotle, God, what does God do? God thinks about the best thing, and the best thing is God. So Aristotle's God just sits there and contemplates himself, which is different from the Christian God who like intervenes in history. So that's Plato. Aristotle. Let me briefly comment on liberal. Well, does anybody have liberal versus educational? Like anybody slightly interested, and I'll mention that, or no? Liberal education versus educational utilitarianism. If I don't see a hand, I won't mention it. Yeah?
So is liberal education just like pretty much getting every subject?
Liberal education is general and trying to develop your capacities as a human rather than just as a single job. It's what you do on the weekends for your leisure time, how to be a good human when you're not working. So it's broad, it's kind of all the subjects you're like actualizing and developing the best that humans can do. You're not just, oh, I'm going to learn how to wire this house. Educational utilitarianism. Why do you get an education? So you can get a job. It's super specific. Liberal education is like, wow, you're going to learn how to appreciate poetry not because it's boring or whatever, but you learn that it's not boring because, wow, imagine this is what humans are capable of. You learn to appreciate music because we have the capacity to create beautiful music. And so it's like how to spend your time on good stuff. And let me tie this into Aristotle now. Liberal education is designed to make you, if you think about it like the army, to be the best you can be fully human, to flourish. And there's a fancy word for Aristotle that means you being the best you can be and flourishing. Starts with an E. Eudaimonia or eudaimonia, whatever. I doubt this would help, but I suppose you could think eudaimonia is like you demand. And like if you have eudaimonia, like you demand, like you are amazing. School of Rock has stick it to demaniosis. Maybe you have eudaimonia, eudamaniosis. You are demand. And if you're demand, you are flourishing. Another word for eudaimonia is blessedness. Another phrase would be like actualizing your potential. And so for Aristotle's ethics, you are acting in accordance with virtue the way you were designed to live. It's like running your car off the best gasoline versus running your car off of beer or soda. Your car is not designed to run on soda, and you are not designed to be a coward and excessively indulging in pleasure and unfair to others. And trying to think of the last cardinal virtue and opposite it, but I can't think of it. And so for Aristotle and the Romans, what are the four things that you are especially designed to do? What are the four things that if you do that, this will really be good in life? the cardinal virtues. Prudence, which is also called wisdom, and prudence and wisdom is being skilled at judging the right choice. Again, the opposite of a CU Boulder student. Or most college students. So that's prudence or wisdom. Temperance. Temperance is using pleasure the right way. It is not rejecting pleasure. It's like Socrates, right? Like he drinks just the right amount. Or you have your giant can of Pringles and you don't eat the whole can. You have like just the right amount of Pringles so you still feel like kind of satisfied. Like you're perfect. You never overindulge. You don't eat the entire thing of what's the Ben and Jerry's that's so good? Tonight Dough. Anybody had Tonight Dough? It's amazing. Oh man, look it up. So like you don't have the whole thing of Tonight Dough, but for temperance, and this is related to Aristotle's golden mean. Remember, the golden mean is there's excess and there's deficiency. So dealing with Tonight Dough and temperance, the pleasure of eating Tonight Dough, the ice cream, if you have excess, you don't have temperance, you imbibe the whole thing and you just chow down and you feel sick and you're like, oh my gosh, I ate too much. But vice versa, it's not like, oh, I'm never going to touch Tonight Dough. You're just going to have the right amount of Tonight Dough and you're going to enjoy it. And so you can have too little temperance or too little pleasure. And Aristotle calls that like you're insensitive. You're like not sensitive enough to pleasure. It's almost like you have no nerve endings almost, right? You can't even feel pleasure. But he thinks most of us have the problem of indulging in pleasure too much. So the golden mean for Aristotle is not too much, not too little, but just right. What was the example with courage? Courage is the golden mean. A coward or being reckless, right? So the four cardinal virtues, we did temperance and then prudence. Courage is one of the other cardinal virtues, right? Like bravery in the right circumstance, not being too stupid, but not being cowardly. And courage is related to fortitude, and fortitude is like being able to endure pain, because oftentimes courage has to do with like facing even a little bit of pain, like even maybe telling the truth, right? And you might face the pain of getting grounded. Or if you're in my house, you never tell the truth and you blame everything on not me. And not me has done so much crap around our house. Like not me does everything wrong in our house. Like who did it? Not me. And I was like, him again. So courage. And then the last one, prudence, justice. And justice is fairness or giving people their due. Sometimes for bad, like punishing them, but sometimes for good, like praising them or rewarding them, right? So that's justice. And so basically for the Greeks and for the Romans, right, your 44 BCE character, not BCE, yeah, no, yes, BCE character, Julius Caesar and Cicero and Cleopatra and Antony and Brutus, the four cardinal virtues, that's how you are designed to live. You develop those virtues, and you're going to probably have a pretty good life. Now, what does all that stuff have to do with character and habit for Aristotle?
When you like get a habit of being having the cardinal virtues, and it'll like happen.
Yeah. So if you just are brave one time, that doesn't mean you're courageous. You need to do it over and over and over again. So until it becomes a habit, and then it becomes part of who you are. It becomes part of your character. That's the idea. So virtue is when it becomes part of your character. And so Aristotle says we become just through doing just actions. If you bowl one strike, that doesn't make you a good bowler. If you bowl 5 strikes in a row, unless you're really like you got to bowl a bunch of strikes, then you're a good bowler. And Aristotle says one swallow does not make a spring. one act of courage doesn't make you courageous, but you do it over and over and over and over again, and then you become just or courageous or temperate or prudence. And now is the time for you to try to do that, because basically Aristotle says when you're my age, if you're not virtuous now, it's too late. And you guys it's getting a little late even for you all as teenagers. He's like, yeah, you got to do it when you're young. You teach them to love the right things. So those are the philosophers. Long answer, but that's most of ancient Greece. Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about the Pericles funeral oration?
All right. Pericles funeral oration. It's taking place during the Peloponnesian War, which is Athens versus Sparta. The important thing about government is Athens is a democracy. And as a democracy, wars are harder to sustain. If you think about it, a king or a dictator or a tyrant, that person can fight as long as they want and just keep sending people to die. But if you're in a democracy, the people got to vote, right? And if all of them are dying, they might not vote to keep the war going. So Pericles is giving a funeral oration. The bodies are coming home, basically. Fathers, sons, brothers are burying their relatives. And Pericles wants Athens to keep fighting in the Peloponnesian War. And so he gives them a cause to fight for, and he praises democracy. And he gives various, it's an ode to democracy. Athens is awesome. We are democratic. Fight for democracy. And democracy is important. This is one of the first instances of democracy in the Western world. So that's Pericles. Rome, St. Augustine, Constantine, any of those things? Or, huh? All right, so in Rome and St. Augustine, I'm on the study guide. Bullet point number 1, summarize the content, background, dates of the 3 documents from Constantine, Theodosius, and Socrates Scholasticus. So kind of quickly, and I'll give you a couple extra minutes or whatever. So Constantine is 313 CE, AD, after Christ, basically. At this time, the first 300 years of Christianity, it's basically illegal. People are getting persecuted. With Constantine, he changes everything. Remember, he has a vision, paints crosses on the shields, and then he wins, and he's like, I like this God. He helps me win. And so what does he say about Christianity? He says, yay. He makes it legal. Doesn't make it the official religion. That's later, but he makes it legal. So now Christianity is legal, and this changes lots of stuff, namely especially when Theodosius comes around in 390, maybe 393, but I think it's 390. There's another act, and Theodosius says Christianity is the official religion. So now instead of people like, you want to be a Christian? Yeah, you might get thrown to the lions. Now it's like, now you want to be a Christian? You have to be a Christian, right? If you don't want to get persecuted. So that changes all sorts of stuff, right? Like at Valor, you have to be a Christian versus anybody can come here. So all of a sudden Christianity becomes super broad. And so Theodosius, that's 390, he makes Christianity official religion. And by 415, Socrates Scholasticus tells us the story of the brilliant pagan philosopher Hypatia, who gets skinned alive because she's not Christian. And so the idea is that I kind of propose is like, look what happens when Christians take power. But you can view this as different ways. Constantine versus Augustine. So Constantine, what does he think about the relationship between the church and the government? No. Constantine he's painting symbols of the cross or of Christianity on the shields of the military. Christianity is totally, like, almost identical with the government, right? The military is marching in God's name. So, in the example I gave, if you were at the Veterans Day ceremony, that would be an example of Constantine, right? We're praying, and pledging allegiance to the flag. That would be kind of Constantine. The example that was given is like a sponge and water, and so Rome, let's say, is the sponge and Christianity is the water, and it sucks up the water. And Christianity, you can't really tell the difference between Christianity and Rome. How is Augustine different? Or Augustine?
Like, the two should mix.
The two shall never mix. He at least wants there to be a distinction between Christianity and Rome. This is the city of God versus the city of men. So the short, super simplistic answer is Constantine, you should mix them. Augustine, keep them separate. I got super basic answer. Couple more. Yeah.
Back to like the beginning when we were talking about, can you go into detail, stories and stuff for each?
Okay. So, so the history of history, first bullet point. Did I already? I can't remember. Did I already tell? So let me start. Tell me if I've told this one. I told it last period for sure. I don't remember if it was this period, this last session. So Croesus and Solon, Oracle of Delphi, Darius, Marathon. So this is the story is all in line, but let me just tell it. The first story I told probably first day of school. Croesus, super rich. I'm gonna go like blow through this. Croesus, super rich, says, "Man, aren't I like super happy because I'm so rich?" Solon, Greek sage, says, call no one happy till they're dead. There's other people that were happier than you. Some dudes who were carrying their mom to a celebration and they died honoring their mother. They were happier than you. Call no one happy till you're dead. He says, okay, whatever. Cyrus is rising in the east in Persia. Croesus goes to the Oracle of Delphi and says, hey, Cyrus, should I declare war on him? Oracle of Delphi says, if you declare war on Cyrus, you will destroy a great empire. He's like, nice, I'll destroy a great empire. So he fights Cyrus. He's the one who dies, or not dies. He's the one who loses the battle. Turns out the oracle was being cryptic and ambiguous, and the great empire that is destroyed is his. By the way, Herodotus is telling the story to warn us against pride and to illustrate how things change. So Croesus was mighty. Notice how Croesus falls, and he ends up being burned at the stake, right? And Cyrus takes him off the stake later. But Herodotus is warning us of change and saying you could be a mighty empire and then you're burned at the stake. Call no one happy till they're dead. Things change. So now Cyrus is dead. His son, or might even be his grandson, I can't remember. Darius is on the throne, or Darius. There is rebellion in Ionia, the Ionian rebellion. Athens or Greece is kind of near that. They help. They burn, the Greeks, the Ionians burn the city of Sardis, like a major city in Persia. Darius is pissed, and he's the one who's like, sire, remember the Greeks. Remember the Greeks. Every time he eats, he has somebody tell him that. So to take vengeance on the Ionians and in Athens, he invades Greece, and they fight the Battle of Marathon. It's 10,000 to like 30,000. Greece wins. And again, Herodotus is telling this story because he's Greco-Persian War. This is the first invasion of Greece. On to Xerxes. This is like the fourth bullet point or whatever. If you need to go, you can. I'll keep going for a little bit. Xerxes now is Darius's son. He's like, Daddy didn't do so well. I'm going to help conquer for Daddy. And so he crosses, and Herodotus again is telling us this, warning of pride and making us know about change. And so Herodotus tells us about Xerxes, and there's various things that Xerxes ignores, and Herodotus is pointing this out. and I don't remember actually the details, but like, remember one of his friends has like 4 sons that are going to have to fight. And he's like, can one of my sons like stay behind so that they can take care of me in old age? And Xerxes like, what? You're doubting me? And he cuts him in half and posts him at the gates as the army is marching out. They're building a bridge across the Hellespont, and there's a storm. And Xerxes is like, bad. He has them whip the water in like defiance of the gods. He marches in with 2 million men, and there's battles of Salamis and Plataea. Salamis is this naval battle, and one of the female advisors, generals, is like, hey, you shouldn't fight here. And Xerxes is like, nah, I'll be fine. And so Herodotus is telling us these stories. Look, Xerxes, you were too proud. And mighty Persia basically is going to be lessened, and Greece, this is how Greece becomes mighty. In the same way that like America becomes mighty by defeating Britain, Greece becomes mighty by defeating Persia in the Greco-Persian Wars. Thucydides. Thucydides is not Greece and Persia. Thucydides is Athens and Sparta. So it's the Greeks against the Persians, and then they're powerful, and like good countries, now they're fighting amongst themselves. And Athens is like, we want to be the most powerful, and Sparta's like, no, you better not. And so it's Athens versus Sparta, Peloponnesian War, and Thucydides talks about power and human nature. And so the Melian dialogue, M-E-L-I-A-N, the island of Melos, this is crash course, they go on, the Athenians go to Melos, and they basically want this island to be on their side. And the island's like, can we just stay neutral? Can we just be Switzerland? And they're like, no. And they're like, come on, don't boss us around. We're powerless. And then there's the famous quote that Thucydides tells us, the strong do what they want, the weak suffer what they must. And Thucydides is telling us the story to illustrate that basically power, when you have power, you do whatever the crap you want. And that's the way it works in the world, and that doesn't change. The second thing he's illustrating is human nature and how people are kind of jacked up when human nature is under pressure. And his example is the plague of Athens. And the plague of Athens, in the plague of Athens, Athens is all behind these walls. A quarter of them are dying. And basically, morality goes out the window in terms of behaving well and, oh, I shouldn't steal from people. Like, it just goes to pot because they're like, I'm going to die. It doesn't matter if I do right or wrong. And Thucydides is like, that's the way it always goes in history. When people are really pressured, when wars happen, and when plagues like that happen, humans, like, just know this, humans are going to act badly. It's like humans behaving badly. Last, we'll just wrap it up with this. Last one is Tacitus. It's important to know he's a Roman historian. So I gave you 3 historians. It's Herodotus, Thucydides, and Tacitus. So Tacitus is horrified. The one word I would use for Tacitus is corruption. Tacitus is a Roman historian. He's horrified at the morality of the emperors. And you have a reading if you want to look at this, and it's like the back page, and it basically says, it talks about how Tacitus is horrified by Tiberius. And Tiberius, you might remember, is the pedophile. He's this cruel, tyrannical pervert. He does so many perverted things that people have to make up words because there's like, oh my gosh, I hadn't even thought you could do that. And so Tacitus is telling history of like, oh my gosh, like, these people are so corrupt and degenerate, and like, look at how bad this character is. This is why Rome sucks. So that's like the 3 historians. All right, let's call it a day.